This is Jim Inkster. Today is November 22nd, 2013, the 50th anniversary of the assassination of President John Fitzgerald Kennedy in Dallas. We'll talk with Richard Lipsey. He served in the U.S. Army from 1962 to 64. He was an aide to the top general for President Kennedy and was present at the autopsy of the president and at his funeral. We'll discuss then and now with Richard Lipsey. Also, he was a U.S. soldier. Lieutenant Lipsey was assigned to the President of the United States, a man from Baton Rouge who went to Washington, and in his first day on the job, he's in the Oval Office, and today he is with us on the 50th anniversary of the assassination of President Kennedy. Like today, it was a Friday, Dallas, Texas, half-century ago. Most Americans were not alive when this event occurred, which some believe is the biggest event of the second half of the 20th century, and it certainly has changed the fabric of this country. No matter what your political persuasion is, I think most people would concur with that. Good morning, Richard Lipsey.
Good morning, Jim. Pleasure to be here.
Well, as I stated, your ride to the White House was an unusual one. Here's this kid from Baton Rouge who suddenly is in the Oval Office meeting the President of the United States at the age of 23. How did that occur?
It really was. I was stationed at Fort Polk, Louisiana, then Camp Polk, and a new general came aboard. The reservists were there, and we came in as the regular army. And when the new general came in, I was fortunate enough to be asked to give him a tour of the post, and I did. Later that evening, he called me over to meet his family and asked me if I would like to be an aide to him. And I really was not sure what the duties of an aide, general's aide, was at the time, but it turned out to be great because just a few months later, General Wheel, Philip Wheel, was transferred to the military district of Washington to take it over, and took me with him to Washington.
And you go to Washington, and you're, I guess, walking to the White House, and you go right to the Oval Office. Now, I've been to the White House. I've talked to one president, but I've never been in the Oval Office. You were you were there for your first day on the job.
Well, that's exactly right. We went to meet the chief of staff when we got to Washington, and he told us that General Wheel's duties, which would include all official ceremonies in Washington, state funerals, visiting dignitaries, the defense of Washington, all of that, and that it was very important that General Wheel meet the president. So he sent us to the White House. We walked into the Oval Office, and President Kennedy came from around his desk, shook hands with both General Wheel and myself, and there was a small table and two little settees around it. And the general and President Kennedy sat on each side, and President Kennedy looked at me and said, "Lieutenant, why don't you just sit right there in my rocking chair?" And so, the famous pictures of all of his rocking chairs. So during their very short, about a 20-minute conversation, I rocked in President Kennedy's rocking chair.
At the age of 23. And he was young, too. He was 45. Were you impressed with him?
I was extremely impressed. Like you said earlier, regardless of your political persuasion, the man was very, very smart. He was a very forward thinker. He had vision that our country has not seen in a long time. He knew where we should be going, not where we had been. He was interested in what writers and painters and artists were thinking. He was really a very intelligent person, a speed reader.
Yeah, when you would hand him these documents, I would imagine he looked at them briefly. And
when I would go back to his office, which was frequently, to brief him on people coming to the White House, he could go through 60, 70, 80 pages in a couple of minutes at the most, and had a perfect photographic memory. He would know everything in that briefing. Amazing man. He really was.
He was a captivating physical presence, too.
Well, he was. He always stood erect, and, you hear about all of his back problems and his different things that were wrong with the president. But he never, ever had any emotion on his face like most of us do when our back hurts, we slump over or we complain. You never, ever heard a word from the president's mouth about that. He was a perfect specimen. And, of course, I picked him up out with a couple of technicians out of his coffin when we got to the Bethesda Naval Hospital and laid him on the morgue table to do the autopsy. There was not an ounce of fat on him. A very perfect physical specimen.
At 46. And you have noted this was the first dead body you had ever seen.
First dead person I had ever seen. But you get wrapped up in the emotion of the event. It's like, one of the out-of-body experiences. We had a job to do. General Wheel assigned me that from the moment that the president's coffin, the body arrived in Washington at Andrews Air Force Base, that I was not to leave it and to guard that. And we got it to the hospital, and General Wheel went upstairs with Jackie Kennedy to the presidential suite to really start planning the funeral. I mean, she had already sent word, although that's one of General Wheel's official duties, and we had a book probably 12 inches thick. Remember, President Eisenhower was still alive, Harry Truman was still alive. Both were quite elderly, so we're pretty up to date on what to do in case of a presidential funeral, state funeral. We had no idea, obviously, anything like this would ever happen. But we were prepared, and when we got that body to the hospital, I went in the morgue with it and did not leave it until the autopsy was over, and went back in after we changed clothes, went back in when Galler's funeral home were there to put the body back together, basically dress the body, embalm him. And so from basically about 7 o'clock that evening, with about a 45-minute break until 4 o'clock in the morning, I was in that autopsy room.
Were you the only soldier who witnessed the autopsy?
I was the only soldier that witnessed the entire autopsy, other than the doctors, of course. There were two, and many times 3 doctors in the room. When we first put the body up on the table, the technicians came in and took photographs and x-rays and prepared the body for the autopsy, and I helped them in that part. And then the room was basically sealed. It was not like the JFK movie that Irving Stone did.
Oliver Stone.
Oliver Stone. I'm sorry, that Oliver Stone did. Where the scene was chaos in the room during the autopsy. There was no chaos in the room. It was quiet, very attentive. The doctors tended to their business, and so it wasn't like the movie at all.
Well, you were standing there. You saw the president. We've seen some of those autopsy photos since. As you say, he was even a handsome man in death. And young, 46 years old at the time. You had been with him for a year. I'm sure had met with him probably 100 times or so during the course of that year, became friendly with him, as friendly as a young man who's a soldier serving the president can be. What was your emotion when you saw him in that condition?
The first impression, well, of course, you have to go back to noon that day, 1:30. We picked General Wheel up in the morning real early, 6:30 in the morning. We go to our office. We lived at Fort Myer, Virginia. That's where all the general row is, where all the generals lived. I was in a BOQ right across from the general's home, living in a very nice BOQ right above Maxwell Taylor, who was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Picked General Wheel up, went to our office, which is at Fort McNair, Virginia, in Washington, not too far from the White House. We brought General Wheel home about noon for lunch. I had lunch, and then our driver, whose name was Sergeant Humphrey, and I were sitting in the car listening to the radio outside of General Wheels' house at 1:30 Washington time.
Right.
And the news broadcast came on. The president's been shot. And that's all I heard. And I jumped out of the car, ran towards the general's house. The general came out of the house at the same time. Did you hear the news? Yes. And it was gripped with emotion. I was. The general was. We got in the car, headed towards the White House. Before we could get out of Fort Myer, Virginia, we had a red phone in our car, which had never rung, ever. And it's one of those direct lines. It was not in those like today with a cell phone. It was one of those operator type deals. But this phone rings, picked it up, and it was the White House, ordering General Wheel to come directly to the White House. And through traffic and people standing there crying in the streets, having to go the wrong way on one-way streets and get up on curbs to get around the traffic, we got to the White House very quickly. And, of course, by then, we were listening to the radio. By then, it had come across that the president, had been shot. The president was dead. So when we got to the White House, there was not much we could do. Everyone was standing around, very emotional, crying. No one really knew what the next step was. They were waiting for news from Dallas. So the chief of protocol was there and advised that we should go immediately to our office and start planning the funeral. And, of course, General Wheel had called and talked to our office. So when we got there at our office, we already had members of every armed service, the Navy, Air Force, Marines, Coast Guard, Army, were all there. The Washington police, even members of the FBI and Secret Service were all already gathered, and to start making plans on what to do when that body got back to Washington.
Well, you were there for the autopsy, and some of the conspiracy theorists have said that the autopsy was bungled. What did you see?
That's really not true, Jim. I've gone back and read lots of notes and lots of books and the things that have been published, and I don't think it was. At the time, and I did not even find this out myself until years later, that they had done a tracheotomy in Dallas to try to save the president's life, which at that point had been kind of a waste. But they did, and they didn't inform the doctors in Washington that they had done a tracheotomy. And so there was a small wound at the bottom of his throat and the other wounds, from the gunshot. And so they did a complete autopsy, and I won't go into certainly those details, but to examine the body to find every fragment of bullet, to see what damage was done to the president. And it was not bungled. It was a good autopsy. Years later, I was privy to an FBI report that outlined the discussions with the FBI with the doctors immediately after the autopsy.
297-5633, your number. We'll return with Richard Lipsey after this 90-second pause on WRKF. This is Jim Inkster. You are listening to 89.3 WRKF in Baton Rouge. Richard Lipsey, Lieutenant Richard Lipsey at the time, on this date in 1963, spent the evening hours presiding over an autopsy of the President of the United States, a man he had come to know well in the preceding year as the soldier assigned to the President at the White House. Richard Lipsey, the pride of Baton Rouge, rubbed shoulders with John Kennedy, who was, if anything describes it, American royalty, And he was killed much too young, 46 years old, on this date, November 22nd, Friday, 1963, Dealey Plaza, Dallas, Texas. Richard Lipsey was at the autopsy, and you have debunked, through your own personal knowledge, some of the conspiracy theories about chaos in the room, but you have come to the conclusion that Oswald acted alone. Why so?
The evidence, in my opinion, supports that. Of course, having watched the autopsy and watched the doctors carefully look at the wounds, the entrance and the exit wounds, the fragments of the bullets, the direction they came from, the number of bullets, all pointed to one shooter. And so while during the autopsy there was no discussion of Lee Harvey Oswald or, who the shooter was, the determination was where he was shot, how many times he was shot, et cetera, et cetera. And then you look at Lee Harvey Oswald. You have this fellow, I think his name was Howard Brennan, that saw a young man in the school book depository, 6th floor, deliberately take aim and shoot the president. And immediately the police, as soon as he found a policeman and told them about it, the police rushed toward the school book depository. In the meantime, Lee Harvey Oswald come down from the 6th floor, goes through the main hall of the school book depository. 2 or 3 people see him rush out. Within 15 to 30 seconds after that, the police come in and seal the building. They take inventory of every person in the building. The only employee of the school book depository that is not there is Lee Harvey Oswald. And then you go back and you look where months before Lee Harvey Oswald, and these were the days you could buy a gun via mail order. And he had ordered the 6.5 Carcana and via mail under an alias that he commonly used. He had the gun. He had plenty of time to practice. He had been in the Marine Corps, and he got kicked out and went to Russia, and he was in Russia, and was a misfit there, and went to Cuba, and he was a misfit there. He was always trying to ingratiate himself on a group, or influence a group, or show his power, but it didn't work. He went to New Orleans and never, tried to get in with the mafia and tried to get in with, the Clay Shaw deal and all of the people there, and that really didn't work. He went to Dallas, so in my mind, he was out to prove that he could do this to the people and that he did not need any of these groups. He was going to show all of them. And if you think about it, they did not announce the president's that he was going to Texas until 4 days before. So where did, I think this was an act of a spur of the moment. He didn't order that gun 6 months before thinking he was going to shoot the president of the United States. This was a spur of the moment thing that came up. He found out the president was coming. The parade route was in the newspaper. Yet when he exited the building, if there had been a conspiracy, there was nobody waiting on him, nobody to rush him away. He went and got on a city bus that got stuck in traffic.
Well,
and took a cab home, and then of course we know what happened after that. But everything points to that Lee Harvey Oswald was a lone assassin, and I firmly believe that.
Well, we'll talk with Vincent Bugliosi as well about this, but there are those who believe, Oswald was one of the shooters, but there were others. You were a firearms expert. The largest distributor of firearms in the United States is the man I'm looking at right now. Uh, how do you explain how Kennedy's head jerks violently backward? Could he have been shot from behind and have that kind of reaction?
It's the Isaac Newton's theory. For every action, there's a reaction. And when you shoot a bullet into something and it exits, the object goes in the opposite direction, goes backwards. And that's exactly what happened to Kennedy. And it's no magic to it. And that's what happened.
So you believe Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone, and I know you're passionate about this. Do you get upset when you hear various conspiracy theories, or do you just blow them off as people who are ignorant about this?
Jim, there have been, ever since Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, there have been conspiracy theorists that meet yearly to discuss, who put John Wilkes Booth up to it. And every single year since John Kennedy has been assassinated, there's a convention with thousands of people that all have their conspiracy theories. And I don't know, I don't think you do or anyone really knows for a fact, all of these rumors from Lyndon Johnson to Onassis to the mafia, to the FBI, to the Russians, who put Lee Harvey Oswald up to it. Nobody knows. And in 50 years, they've never been able to tie down anything to it. So it is all theory. And so people would like to figure it out, but they've never been able to. Why did Jack Ruby shoot Oswald? Did somebody put him up to it? I don't think so. I think he hung around the police station all the time. And I think he got tied up in the emotion of the whole thing and said, I'm going to kill this guy. He was in the hospital for months, as you know, dying of cancer. And they've never been able to tie him to anyone. So I think it's all a matter of circumstance. I think Oswald acted alone.
Oswald acted alone, says Richard Lipsey. One thing is for sure, it changed the fabric of America. You were 24 then, so according to my math, you'll be 74 today if you're 50 years later. A remarkably resilient 74-year-old man is Richard Lipsey, but your life and the lives of everybody in this country and in this world changed as a result of that. What do you think the impact of that day in Dallas 50 years ago today is on the country and the world as we know it today?
That's a very good question. I guess you could look back and say, where would the world be if John Kennedy had lived with his vision and foresight, wanting to land a man on the moon, wanted to tear down the Berlin Wall. I mean, he was a very forward-looking person, and so how would the world have changed if he would have had his 8 years in office? It's all about the time and the circumstance, and we've been through Vietnam, we've been through Iraq and Iran and the Gulf War, and times have changed. I don't think we have the leadership in our country that we deserve. I can remember as a kid Democrats and Republicans arguing with each other, then all going out to dinner at night and having fun. And in the end, they all came to a consensus. And I think our country, there's too much divisiveness in our country today. And I think we need to bring our country together to work as one. And I worry about that, Jim. I worry about the future of our country. And I think that the impact of the assassination on Kennedy gives people something to read. I get questioned all the time. I don't talk to a lot of groups, but I do talk to some. And, of course, the questions about the conspiracy, the questions, are you sure that there was only one shooter? so many people say bullets came from different directions there at Dealey Plaza, and I have not, I'm embarrassed to say, I have not read Reclaiming History. I would like to. It's I just haven't had time. Another author, Gerald Posner, wrote a book called Case Closed, which is, to me, puts it all in perspective.
Well, I know through the years you haven't done a lot of interviews, and I've been pleased to see that you've done several print interviews, and today you're spending time with us. And Ruth Laney did a fine piece in Country Roads. George Morris did an exceptional piece in Sunday's Advocate with Richard Lipsey, who was there for the autopsy on this date in 1963. You were 24 years old at the time. After experiencing something like that, it seems that life can be a little mundane. I'm sure it's had an effect on you personally.
Well, you know, for 15 years I could not speak of this. I don't know whether I told you this earlier, but I had to sign the National Securities Act right after the autopsy, and which said I could not discuss this with anyone, my family, my wife, which I was not married at the time, for 15 years. And you forget a lot. And, you know, you put it out of your mind. And, you know, 15 years and a few days later, I go to my office one morning at 8 o'clock and I open the door. And behind me, two gentlemen in suits get out of their automobile and walk up to me and said, "Are you Richard Lipsey?" "Yes." "Were you in the U.S. Army in 1963? "Yes." "Were you in Washington?" "Yes." "We're the attorneys for the House Committee on Assassinations, and we want to talk to you." And they came in my office, and we talked for almost 3.5 hours. And those kind of things, they end up on, you know, after, I think it was 1997 when they released a lot of information, they all end up on the internet. So I think this may be the first live radio interview that I've ever done. Every time I talk to somebody about it, they want to challenge what I say, just like your interview just then with Mr. Bugliosi. What he says is definitive. But there are going to be people. How many did he say? There are 244 different theories and groups that are certain they're right.
Right.
So what can I say, Jim? I'm in total agreement with him. And the Warren Commission was accurate. There was a single lone shooter, and it was Lee Harvey Oswald.
Well, on that day, Walter Cronkite broke the news to America, but later that night, one of the best pieces was done by Edwin P. Newman of NBC, who had gone to LSU. And here's how Edwin P. Newman described what had happened on this day 50 years ago.
The lives of all of us have today been profoundly changed. It's not yet possible to say exactly how much or in precisely which particulars, but they have been irrevocably changed. In these circumstances, I hope that I may be allowed a personal reaction, which perhaps will also be the reaction of some others. One's first feeling, of course, was that it was a dream, not real. After that came the dispiriting, hopeless feeling that it was banal, an absurdity, and that is the feeling that persists. Foreigners have been asking all day, how can you let this sort of thing happen? Well, we don't let it happen. Someone will someday have to say how a man with a high-powered rifle got into a building along the route in Dallas, but this is a country of 190 million people. Basically, it's true that if someone wants badly enough to kill the president, provided he's willing to take some risk himself, he has a very good chance of doing it. Such people are happily extremely rare. And we do not know at this moment who killed the president or why. We may say with justice that it was an act of insanity and the rest of us are sane. It has nevertheless brought us face to face with some unpleasant truths about ourselves. The main point that emerges from this day's events is that the United States is still a country of violence. Violence plays a part in our political life, and not only through assassination. We've seen that in the last 3 years and in the years before that. We are, some of us, in the habit of laughing at the Latin American nations for the way in which their governments turn over. A lot of them do turn over. Assassination, however, does not play a large part in their affairs. Latin American governments usually turn over without much killing. To pursue this point further, we are a people who worry a great deal about our image. It must be said that at this time our image is not a very desirable one. We do not appear today as an adult country. For what happened today is not an isolated incident. There were attempts against President Roosevelt and against President Truman in our own time. 3 presidents before Mr. Kennedy died at the hands of assassins. So we have a nation in which emotions run high and in which conflicts are often stark. These conflicts arise from a number of sources: regional, economic, racial, religious, and ethnic. The problem is to contain those conflicts and to reduce the influence of violence and the threat of violence in our politics.
That's Edwin P. Newman, 50 years ago tonight on NBC. And Richard Lipsey, you've served our country with distinction. Today you'll be involved with some events at Louisiana State University.
Yes, today is the Cadets of the Old War School weekend at LSU. We will have a lot of very honorable retirees return to the campus today, and we will salute several past members of the LSU ROTC that graduated from LSU and went on to serve their country admirably. And we will salute those people today and tomorrow morning. And so our Cadets of the Old War School luncheon is today, and the ceremony will be tomorrow morning.
Parade grounds, right? At the parade grounds?
No, because of the weather. It's been moved into the LSU Union. It is on the parade ground normally, but for the threat of the weather, we're moving inside.
And tonight, Richard Lipsey and some others will be at the Manship Theater at 7 o'clock, a showing of Parkland, and there will be a panel discussion about the Kennedy assassination. We look forward to seeing you then, and thank you so much for spending time with us today.
It was my pleasure. Thank you, Jim. I enjoyed it.
And, of course, throughout the day on WRKF, we will hear more about what happened on this day 50 years ago.